This is Hear Me Out. I'm Celeste Headley. The first Pride was a protest, but is queer liberation inherently anti-government? You'll hear a lot of discussion about that dynamic this month as Pride Month festivities take place in cities across the country. When a political figure like Jill Biden takes the stage at a Pride event, some people feel supported. When Pride attendees see police, some of them feel safer. But a lot of queer people feel like their presence is a hostile incursion into a community that was and is at odds with the government. So should Pride actually be for everyone, or everyone other than cops and politicians?
As a sex worker in this community who also considers myself to be queer and part of the LGBTQ community, I do not have trust in the government to have LGBTQ and sex worker and other people with marginalized sexual and gender identities' best interest at heart, or to be interested in protecting them.
Jessie Sage, a Pittsburgh-based writer, joins Hear Me Out in just a moment. Stay with us. Welcome back to Hear Me Out. I'm Celeste Headley. As we celebrate Pride Month, let's recall last year's celebration that was marked by a weird squabble over light beer. Bud Light collaborated with trans influencer Dylan Mulvaney on a social media post, and many on the conservative right responded with hysteria, overwrought think pieces, and an unsurprising boycott. Perhaps all you remember about that is Kid Rock opening fire on a case of Bud Light that he probably paid for. But the boycott was pretty successful. The Harvard Business Review found that Bud Light sales declined by about 30% for 8 months after the onset of that controversy. Now, around this time last year, we talked on the show about rainbow washing and whether corporations actually accomplish anything for anybody when they throw their support behind a cause like Pride. This year, we'll look at another powerful force in society, not corporations, but the government, and ask whether the government and its agents should be involved in Pride celebrations. Our guest today says no. Jessie Sage is a freelance writer, sex worker, and podcast host, and joins us now. Hello there.
Hi, thank you for having me.
So for those who don't know you, tell us what you do.
Yeah, I am a Pittsburgh-based writer and sex worker. I write a weekly column called Pillow Talk with Jessie Sage for Pittsburgh's Alt Weekly, which is the Pittsburgh city paper. And I also currently host a podcast called When We're Not Hustling, which is sex workers talking about everything but. So every week I have a different sex worker on and we talk about not sex work, because I've spent the last 10 years talking about sex work politics, and I was ready to have some different conversations. So that's what I'm doing now. But I also have been in the sex industry for the last 10 years. I've worked in a variety of different capacities within the industry. And I also was the person, me and a partner started the SWAP Pittsburgh chapter, which is a sex worker outreach project. So I do a lot of local activism and writing.
Speaking of writing, the reason we're talking to you today is because of something you wrote that sounds like it may have been inspired by both the idea of banning cops from the Pride festivals and parades, but also from the appearance of Jill Biden. Mm-hmm. Coming on stage at a Pride event saying, "I love you," which is a very sweet sentiment, mm-hmm. But she had, as expected, a whole security detail, et cetera, et cetera. So in a couple brief sentences, what is the spicy opinion you bring to us today?
It's funny because when I was asked to do this, I was thinking, I don't know what's so spicy about this opinion. It's like, this is hardly a hot take, but maybe I'm in a bubble. My concern was that what happened at Pittsburgh Pride, so is that Jill Biden came with a security detail and displaced a lot of queer vendors, some of whom were my friends, and people who were there to celebrate Pride in community, and turned it, instead of a Pride celebration, into a Jill Biden photo op. And it also brought, obviously, the First Lady doesn't just show up by herself. She shows up with, like you said, her entire security detail, which brings a lot of cops into Pride. Cops were already at the Pride, but obviously that amplifies tremendously when somebody at the stature of the First Lady comes in. And My concern is that that takes away from the people who are there, for whom the event is for, the LGBTQ community.
So maybe this is a logistical thing. If they had planned better so that the First Lady could come in safety without disrupting and displacing, would you been okay with it?
I would have been more okay with it, but I still don't think that that's what we should be focusing on. I think even if she came in, even if she was helicoptered in and there was nobody around her and it didn't displace anybody, I still think that what happens when politicians come in is that she's obviously campaigning, which is fine. Like you have to campaign. I don't have a problem with politicians necessarily campaigning, but I don't think that Pride is the place to do that. I think that it takes away from the spirit of Pride, and I think that we don't. It becomes about her. So all of a sudden, news stories are coming out about how she is the first lady to have ever spoken at a Pride event. How progressive and amazing it is that she is doing that. All the pictures are now pictures of her on stage with different Pittsburgh organizers. And I feel like even if she didn't create a huge displacement of folks, like it still symbolically displaces them when the focus becomes her.
So here's the thing, though, and there's a lot to unpack here. I mean, the reason I know why your take is kind of a hot take is because I've seen a number of op-eds from queer publications saying we should let the police and others let the police at Pride celebrations and others have praised politicians for attending. So let's go with that first, because I have also seen people writing and complaining when a politician does not
Mm-hmm.
step forward to support Pride, does not show up at Pride events. When they just tweet something
Mm-hmm.
and they don't show up, they get,
Mm-hmm.
excoriated. Oh, it took you 10 seconds. You could have, gone.
Yeah.
So I mean, it sounds like they can't win for losing.
I hear that. And I understand that position. And even at the beginning of my piece, I was like, I actually don't usually comment on these things, even though I'm a sex columnist and that I write about LGBTQ stuff is obviously within my wheelhouse. But like I understand that position, but I also feel like there's a lot of ways of supporting folks and that turning it into something about you is not support. So, yes, I think that I am a sex worker rights advocate. So, but I know that I don't speak for all sex workers. I have a very particular positionality. I can, for example, support trans Black sex workers who are much more marginalized than I am and promote their events and be very supportive of the work that they're doing. But I can't show up and be the speaker at one of their events. That doesn't make any sense, right? So I feel like there's a way that we can support people, and that we can support groups and we can support what they're doing without taking over and without making it about us and without speaking for those communities.
So maybe it's because of Jill Biden's high profile. Maybe it's because this is an election year, right?
Mm-hmm,
Like those
mm-hmm.
things mean that she did take over. What if it was just your local state representative who was not up for election?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is all like very complicated. I think that
Yeah.
because I hear what you're saying, and I also understand. I do understand the positions that you're bringing up of like we do want our officials to support us. Isn't that what we're trying to achieve in LGBTQ rights community,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
That I understand that, but I also think that there is like a time and a place for things, and I think that I think that the point that you're making is good. Is that like it is an election year? She is a very high status person, a high profile person, so that does shape the way that people are interacting with her at the event. If it was somebody that's like a very local person who you would think would show up at local events, That seems different, but I think, to be honest, I'm still not stoked about that because I feel like we need to ask ourselves like what they're doing there, what they're doing at the events, and whether they're adding to the work that the queer community is doing or whether they're doing their own work there.
So this is such a fine line for me. And I am not queer. I am as boring and cisgendered straight as they get. So I cannot understand it from your perspective. But I do understand it being Black and Jewish from the perspective
Hmm.
of the fact that I I want Ted Cruz to come to our events. I want him to not other us.
Yeah.
I want him to see us when we're joyful, not just when we are protesting or advocating.
Yeah.
I want him to see us as real people and human beings.
Hmm.
And isn't that kind of, I mean, one of the things I love about Pride events is, they're so expressive. There's this invitation for members of the LGBTQ plus community to just express themselves. And it is fantastic,
Hmm.
and also these are people, they
Right.
many of them made their costumes themselves. Like there's something so humanizing about that joy.
Right. Right. Yeah, I mean, I think it is a fine line, and I understand the position that you're coming with. I think that there are a lot of places to be able to see that, and I guess that the main concern that I have is what it means when they come. Like I am not saying that um a politician can't show up and be in the crowds. I'm saying that like it's not an event
Oh, they're
about
not supposed to
them.
speak.
Yeah, it's not an event about them. And like, because there was some pushback for against me saying that I don't want cops to be there too. Like our police chief, for example, in Pittsburgh is gay. And people are like, well, what about our gay police chief? And my thought about that, I mean, I want to be like, no, no cops at Pride, but like really, I'm a little bit more moderate than that in the sense that I think like yes, it depends on what capacity you're coming in. Like this is an event for and about the LGBTQ community that's put on by the LGBTQ community. Our politicians should be coming as, if they want to come, they should be coming as crowds to be able to like be among people and see all of that and absorb that. But it's not about them and their platforms and their photo ops and all of that. I don't think that they should be speaking. I think that if that's, and to the point of the police, like, and the police chief that we have here, like I don't think that people should be in at Pride in a police capacity. I'm not particularly comfortable, as a sex worker with police being in my spaces, but I feel like for a lot of people, they are less uncomfortable around the police. But I think
Interesting.
we share a like I think that police presence, especially now as our police have become more and more militarized, changes the feeling at a event like Pride. Especially for a community that has historically been very heavily policed for their sexuality and their gender identity. And I think that I would say the same thing about the politicians is, yes, it would be great for them to humanize the LGBTQ community, to understand that these are people with lives and families and joy and friendships and all of the things that help us to humanize people. But like, what capacity are they there in? Is it about them or is it about the community?
Okay, we have a couple minutes before we take a break. So, and we're going to talk a lot about police coming up, but I don't want to move away from politics quite just yet because, so often Pride events are, at least in part, supported by the government.
Mhm.
Are you also saying that shouldn't happen? Like, where's the line in terms of government support and involvement? Should they be silent partners?
You mean in terms of funding for those events?
Right. Or, I mean,
Mhm.
I can imagine if I'm a politician and I want to be seen as a friend to the queer community,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
And the organizers ask me to speak because that's what they do when they want a politician to continue supporting their event,
Right, right,
right?
right. Mhm.
So they ask me to speak. Am I then supposed to go ahead and say no? Or would that be seen as insulting the queer community? Where's the line there for me?
Yeah. I mean, if you're going to ask me what I think, you know,
That's what this whole show is about, Jessie.
I don't think that I think they should be silent. Yes, I do think that they should be silent. I do.
How do they say that to the event organizers? How do they turn down that request?
I think that they should say something like, I want to be in support of what you're doing, but I don't, and do that through donations or through like whatever it is that they can do to be supportive. But this is your platform, and I will make a statement in some through media or something like that. But I don't want to be center stage at an event that is supposed to celebrate your identity.
Okay, I hope all the politicians listening took note. We will take a quick break. We will be back to talk about the cops. I'm speaking with Jessie Sage about whether or not the government needs to show up and speak its mind at Pride events. And we will continue this conversation in a moment. This is Hear Me Out, a podcast from Slate.
This podcast is sponsored by IQ Bar.
I've got good news and bad news. Here's the bad news. Most protein bars are packed with sugar and unpronounceable ingredients. The good news? There's a better option. I'm Will, and I created IQ Bar plant protein bars to empower doers like you with clean, delicious, low-sugar brain and body fuel. IQ Bars are packed with 12 grams of protein, brain nutrients like magnesium and lion's mane, and zero weird stuff. And right now, you can get 20% off all IQ Bar products, plus free shipping. Try our delicious IQ Bar sampler pack with 7 plant protein bars, 4 hydration mixes, and 4 enhanced coffee sticks. Clean ingredients, amazing taste, and you'll love how you feel. Refuel smarter, hydrate harder, caffeinate larger with IQ Bar.
Go to eatiqbar.com and enter code BAR20 to get 20% off all IQ Bar products plus free shipping. Again, go to eatiqbar.com and enter code BAR20.
Welcome back. I'm Celeste Headlee. This is Hear Me Out, and today we're talking to Jessie Sage, and her opinion is that pride is not for politicians and police. So we talked before the break quite a bit, Jessie, about politicians, and I feel like there's more to examine there, but let's move on to the police.
Okay. You're right. It's very complicated. And
It is.
It's very complicated. Yeah.
Yeah. So let's move on to the police. I am none of the things we're talking about today. I am not queer. I am not a politician. I am not a police officer. Mm-hmm. But I can understand why so many members of the queer community have stepped forward to protest against the decision to ban police from some pride marches. Mm-hmm. I think that began in sometime around 2017 when in some cities, event organizers decided to ban police from participating. And you referred to that before. Mm-hmm. So I want to go into this more because obviously there's the first one, which is like, what does the ban mean? Are they not marching? Then do you not want them to protect you, especially at this time when members of the LGBTQ plus community are at higher risk than maybe probably not at any other time, but it's pretty high.
It's pretty high. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So what does that ban in your mind? What does preventing them from the marches? What does that mean?
It means that they don't show up in uniform, armed and ready.
Even if they're working.
Well, no, I don't want police working the Pride Parade. No.
You don't want them even there to protect.
No, I think we need to ask like, protect who? Like, who is it that the police are protecting? And historically, I don't have a lot of faith that the police are protecting the LGBTQ community. I mean, one of the things that I talked about is the fact that, and I mean, I don't want to open up a whole nother like can of worms, but the article that I wrote was situated in Pittsburgh. You know, I'm a columnist in Pittsburgh, and I was talking about what was happening there. And at the same time that Pride was going on downtown, across town at the university, the police were literally beating the protesters at the Gaza encampments, you know, and many of those students who were there are LGBTQ students who felt fairly like betrayed by by that. And I think that if we look at the Black Lives Matter protests, like so much of the violence was like police on the protesters, police on the people who were at the events. And so I'm not operating under the assumption that the police are there to protect marginalized people. Police are there to protect and uphold the status quo. And that's not LGBTQ people. So I'm hard pressed to believe that marginalized people who have increasingly criminalized identities feel safer with the police than without them.
But I remember after the Pulse nightclub shooting in 2016, calls from the LGBTQ plus community saying, hey, there were threats and the police did nothing. So let me say that first, that when something occurs, that there's always outrage. And if there were no police at a pride parade and there were a mass shooting, the first thing that would be said is, where were the police? I think.
But I mean, does your point about the Pulse nightclub, doesn't that more or less back up what I was saying, though, which is that the police like didn't protect the LGBTQ community?
Yes, but isn't the solution to have them protect the LGBTQ plus community?
In an ideal world? I don't know that we live in an ideal world. I think that this is
I mean, we never will. Yeah. I mean, you do the best you can, right?
Right. Yeah. And I hear what you're saying, and the position that I'm coming from, and I can only speak from my own positionality, is that I don't have faith that the police are here to protect the lives of the sexual outlaws. I don't have faith that the police see it as their job to protect those who are sexually marginalized and policed. And that like is only becoming more and more apparent as more laws are being put into place that are taking away LGBTQ rights.
How does that, I mean, if we have a member of law enforcement listening who's also queer, what would you say to them about this position?
About their position?
Your position that they shouldn't be there.
Yeah. I mean, I think I was...
in uniform.
Yeah. Because I was going to say, I think I was pretty clear, like in the capacity as a queer person. Sure.
No, but they might want to represent. I mean, they might want to represent and say, look, some members of law enforcement are queer. We're cops too.
Yeah, well, when their police unions quit endorsing politicians that strip LGBTQ people of their rights, then maybe I might buy that more.
Okay, so then let me read you something that was from an op-ed piece in The Advocate by Maura Currie. And it was called, the piece itself was called "Why Police Should Have a Place at Pride." And Amanda said that you can't, while it's, the excuse that not all cops, there's one bad apple. She doesn't buy that. But she says, a cop from rural Wyoming can be very different from a cop in New York City.
Sure.
Because of this, there shouldn't be a call to remove police from pride celebrations overall. She says, I understand the reluctance of cities such as, say, Baltimore or Ferguson, Missouri, not wanting cops at their pride celebration because those police forces have serious department-wide issues of violence toward people of color and massive corruption. However, there are police departments in this country that have made huge strides to reduce police violence, racial profiling, corruption, militarization, and have adopted a more community-focused approach. They have civilian review boards, community relations departments that work with local minorities to address issues unique to them. Would you agree with her that it could be on a case-by-case basis? Or no?
Yes, I mean, I can't. I mean, I think it's important to say that I cannot speak for all people in all places. I am obviously living in a mid-sized city in the United States that has its own particularities, and so I've never lived in a rural town. I don't know what those dynamics look like. It's not my place to say that. I'm actually speaking out from the milieu that I'm like familiar with. And in the place that I'm familiar with as a sex worker in this community, who also considers myself to be queer and part of the LGBTQ community, I do not have trust in the government and the politicians and the police to have LGBTQ and sex worker and other people with marginalized sexual and gender identities to have their best interest at heart or to be interested in protecting them. So that's the position I can speak from. I don't know what's happening in rural America. I don't think that I can make a statement about that and have it.
Breaking news, Jessie Sage doesn't care about rural America.
No.
Oh, sorry. I'm kidding.
No, and that's not
Totally
that's not what I'm saying.
No.
But what I'm saying is
No, I
it's really
understand.
difficult for me to speak on that. Like I've never lived in those communities. And if anything, I think that it's really hard. And I think that this is part of the issue that we have with a country as large as the United States. Universal policies don't seem to make sense across like varied communities. And when I wrote my piece, I wasn't expecting to talk about it on a national level. I was more like talking about what's happening in Pittsburgh. And which isn't to say that I don't care what's happening outside of that, but I do think that I hear her point. I don't claim to have.
Look, every opinion that's here is one that's up for debate.
Yeah.
So that's the whole purpose.
Yeah.
But let me bring you another one that's from your neck of the woods.
Yeah.
Jamie Paul, I don't know if you know him. He is the managing editor at Career Majority, which is based out of Philly.
Mm-hmm.
He wrote a piece saying, "Let the cops march at Pride." And he said this: "In terms of politics, turning away or making adversaries of law enforcement is an unforced error. It is to the LGBT community's benefit to broaden support, further improve public favorability, and build bridges. Being mainstream may not feel sexy to young activists with pretensions of revolution and their fists upthrust, but it is the gold standard for cultural progress. It is the very purpose of cultural activism." What do you think?
I mean, what does he think pride is? I mean, I think that's, I mean, my question is like, is pride a celebration of, I mean, I'll say it this way. Pride at its start in 1970, the first commemoration of Stonewall, was a celebration of the 1-year anniversary where queer people stood up against the policing of their communities and their sexuality and their gender and the police raids that were constantly taking place in their establishments. And I think that that is the legacy of Pride, and that's what Pride is supposed to be. And I think that there's different ways in which we can think about what the purpose of queer activism is. And there are a lot of people who say that the purpose of activism, like the person that you just quoted, is to assimilate and gain respectability as much as possible, to be integrated into the mainstream. I am not coming from that position. I do not think that the goal of queer community is to be integrated into the mainstream. And I think that holding on to our identities as identities that aren't part of the status quo is important.
Okay, we're going to take another quick break and we will return to this conversation in just a moment. I still feel like there's a lot to talk about. And frankly, Jessie, I think we're going to get a lot of responses because as you keep referring to, this is an ongoing conversation. Finding these boundaries is not easy. But we'll take a break. This is Hear Me Out. I'm speaking with Jessie Sage about whether or not the government and police should be at pride parades. And we will continue this conversation in just a moment. Thanks for staying with us. This is Hear Me Out, a podcast from Slate. I'm Celeste Headley. Today, I'm speaking with Jessie Sage, and the question is, should police and politicians and basically government representatives be allowed to attend pride events, and especially parades, in the uniform of their job? Jessie says no. And we've talked about politicians, especially Joe Biden. We've talked about police. But are those the only two categories that you're including? I assume when you say law enforcement, you mean all in law enforcement. That would be the NSA. That would be everybody. What about the military? If there's a lot of queer people in the military, can they wear their uniform?
That's a good question. I think especially given like the history of like don't ask, don't tell.
Yes.
That I think, I've never been in the military. I think that if I was in the military and I was an out queer person, that there would feel like something liberatory about being an out queer person in my uniform. That
Yeah.
I can understand why that would feel powerful. I think that there is something different about those things for the reason that I just said, and also because it isn't the job of the military to police gender identity and sexual orientation and expression. And I think that that matters. Whereas it is the job of the politicians who make rules and make laws that legislate the lives of LGBTQ plus folks. And it's the job of police to enforce those rules. And so to me, it's about power in relation to the LGBTQ community. And when you have politicians who are responsible for legislating our lives and police who are responsible for making sure that we're in compliance with that legislation, that means that those two groups of people stand in opposition to like sexual and gender freedom and expression. And I don't know that the military has the same relationship to the LGBTQ community, but I also am willing to be wrong about that.
So if we have people listening who are organizers of pride events, whether it be in some, in Poughkeepsie or in New York City.
Yeah.
I mean, I think everybody is trying to figure out where these boundaries are.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, I feel like I just want to say I have no skin in this game. These are not my events. I like to attend.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
So it's not up to me to say whether I agree with you or not. But I would like to say that I hope there are lots and lots more pride events.
Mm-hmm.
And I hope that people feel safe when they're there.
Yeah.
Whether that's because the police are there or because they're not there.
Right, right.
So what advice might you give at this point to an organizer who's feeling out these boundaries and is also unsure of where they are?
Mm-hmm. I think that my biggest piece of advice would be to talk to the communities that you're serving. I mean, to feel that out from the people in your community itself. And I think that's easier said than done because obviously these are contentious things and there are going to be people within the community who feel safer with the police there and people within the community who feel safer with them not there. As a sex worker, I would feel safer with the police not there than I would with the police there. I think that maybe I think that given the trans legislation and the legislation against drag queens and things like that, there are probably a lot of gender nonconforming people who would feel that way as well. And there might be a lot of gay and lesbian people who've been more assimilated into our culture who would feel safer with people, with the police there. And I'm not saying that that's exactly how the fault lines go. And obviously individual people have different experiences, but I do want to recognize and hold space for the fact that that is actually a difficult thing. But my first impulse is always to turn to the community that you're serving and as an organizer or advocate and talk to them. I mean, within sex work, we have a often cited mantra of like nothing about us without us. And I mean, that's true for disability communities as well. That's fairly common in marginalized communities. But I think that the spirit of that is like we ought to not be making decisions for people without talking to them about how those decisions impact them. And that seems true in this case too, which is why I'm reluctant to have kind of blanket statements about this, even though my impulse was to say what I said in my piece, which is that I don't think that, at least in the case of Pittsburgh, that we should have had politicians or cops there.
So, I mean, we're coming to the end of this debate. I mean, I have to say that the part of your argument that really resonates with me is the fact that we really are not that far away from when sodomy was illegal.
Right.
To when that very who you are was an illegal thing to be. And I get that. I mean, I absolutely get that because we say all the time, at least within the Black community, that it hasn't been that long since police began as slave patrollers.
Yeah, right.
It's tough, though. I mean, it's tough in this era of mass shootings, and you look at places like Uvalde, and the criticism is all about why didn't you go in sooner?
Mm-hmm.
Why didn't you act more quickly?
Mm-hmm.
And then I just have a feeling like any kind of mass gathering is also a source of existential dread for Americans.
Yeah.
So I'm going to give you the last word here.
I guess my question, I understand that, and I feel that existential dread, and I guess my impulse is to say that police presence has been a source of existential dread for a lot of marginalized communities, and not the answer.
Okay, Jessie, thank you so much. This is fascinating to me. I mean, it's important, but it's also really interesting.
Thank you for having me on.
Whether or not you're a part of the queer community, we are sure you have opinions about the politics of Pride events. Maybe your local police or politicians attend these Pride Month celebrations. How do you feel about that? Let us know. Email us. It's hearmeout@slate.com. A few weeks ago, we had Eric Zitzowitz on the show to discuss betting on elections, and there was a lot to unpack in that conversation. So before we go, we want to share an email we got from a listener named Josh. Thanks for the excellent debate with Eric Zitzowitz. I think you got him to retreat a little bit when you made the case that publishing bookmakers' odds on elections would cause many people to refrain from voting. I think you could have pressed this point further. We have a real-life example of this. How many times in 2016 did we hear that Hillary Clinton had a 73% chance of winning? There is no doubt in my mind that hearing this probability figure convinced thousands of Hillary supporters that it was not essential for them to make it to the polls on that particular Tuesday. So, Josh, thank you so much. And you're correct. There is pretty good research supporting that. In fact, not just the polls, but the campaign analysts who did not believe Donald Trump had a chance did, in fact, suppress some Democratic votes. But we love hearing from you. Whatever it is you have a thought upon, we want to hear it. So let us know what's on your mind. It's hearmeout@slate.com. Hear Me Out is a podcast from Slate. The show is produced by Maura Currie. Ben Richmond is the Senior Director of Podcast Operations, and Alicia Montgomery is the VP of Slate Audio. I'm your host, Celeste Headley. Until next time, speak your mind, but please keep it open.
This is the story of the one. As a maintenance engineer, he hears things differently. To the untrained ear, everything on his shop floor might sound fine, but he can hear gears grinding or a belt slipping. So he steps in to fix the problem at hand before it gets out of hand. And he knows Grainger's got the right product he needs to get the job done, which is music to his ears. Call, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.